Well, fellow makers, Old Make Things did it again. Back when I made my table saw sled, I made the angular part more difficult than it needed to be. A viewer contacted me on Reddit and told me his saw tilted oddly and challenged me to make a jig he could make to solve his problem. Not being one to shirk a challenge, I came up with a tilting bed that will work on any table saw sled. Here is my design. Oh, and if you have a challenge for a problem that you're facing in your shop, throw it my way. I love a good challenge. Really. First, I found the sled I've sworn to throw away several times the last few years. It's inaccurate, has a short bed, it's perfect. If I can make this work on this piece of junk, anyone can make this work. We're going to make 2 layers of wood stacked on top of each other, so we'll measure width and height. This is the first layer. The second layer will be 2 halves put together to be the size of the first. On the first layer, we'll add a piano hinge. I think it's important to use a hinge like this as it guarantees both top and bottom are parallel. We'll flush cut the hinge into the first layer by drawing a line and dropping our blade the full width of the closed hinge. I made a test cut to make sure it fully fit the thickness of the hinge. Next, I line up the pencil line I marked earlier and cut the width of the hinge. I'm using a low profile T-track that measures about 3/8 of an inch. They're not always easy to find, but I have a link to some in the description. This is going to fit inside our first layer, so we'll want the blade to be slightly higher than the T-track. It's important to remember we'll be cutting on the side that we cut out of the hinge space. I found the width of the T-track before finding the width of the board, and then cut a straight line down the middle. Then I took the T-track and marked either side of the line I cut. This space in here will hog out. It needs to slide smoothly in the cut groove. To keep the hinge from being a pain in the backside, I used hot glue to keep it in place. I piloted some holes before adding the screws. Because I've never been able to find screws smaller than a 1/2 inch, and my plywood has been cut less than a 1/2 inch, I needed to file the screws down, which you can easily do with a metal file. We'll create the hinge top layer by putting the pieces together and drawing lines on both sides of the piano hinge. We'll need to hog out both sides so that the hinges fits in the middle. But we'll also need to add this T-track next to the center. I gave myself about a 1/2 of an inch from the hinge and marked out the width of the track. Yet again, I dropped the blade for the low profile T-track and hogged out the space for the track. It's important to remember that the hinge groove is going to be hogged out on the opposite side of the track. I dropped the blade down to the width of the second piano hinge, measured over half the hinge, and hogged it out. The hinge fits perfectly inside, below the surface of the plywood. Now, before we go and start assembling, I measured a random distance over and cut both corners out of the plywood half that won't have the T-track in it. You can use anything to cut these out. Bandsaw, it doesn't matter, but I tried to be as minimalistic as I could be by using a pull saw. When that was done, I used some hot glue to put the second hinge in place before piloting and adding screws. And filing down the screw side. We'll use a little epoxy now to add the T-tracks to the plywood. I think clamping is important here and will prevent any floating that the epoxy might try to do. Next, we'll raise the first layer up with a piece of scrap plywood and we'll line up the second layer. It's important to keep both pieces parallel to the front face of the sled so that everything is accurate. I traced out the screw holes onto the second layer with a pencil using awl, drilled pilots, and screwed it on. No, I didn't need to file the screws this time. In the corners that I cut out, I drilled an approximate center hole through the first layer and the sled. These are basically just reference holes. On the sled, I used a 3/4 inch Forstner bit in each of the reference holes, but only deep enough for the thickness of the T-nut. I used a 5/16 inch drill bit for the barrel of the T-nut to fit in, put a bolt in, and hammered it in. This, of course, won't be enough, so we'll use epoxy to glue them in. It goes without saying that each T-nut should be below the sled bed. The reference point we made on our jig should also get drilled out. Now that we've done that, we'll make a couple thumb knobs that will lock the jig to the sled. These are simple to make. I used an 1.25 inch bolt, some epoxy, and added a 1/4 inch wing nut. The last thing we'll need to make that will allow our bed to pivot and bend to our heart's desire is a small stop block. You'll need a 1/4 inch hex bolt and a rectangular piece of wood with a hole drilled in the center. And it's done. Now, before I go into the usage of this jig, I need to point out that you need some sort of hold-down device for your T-track. There are several different varieties you can buy online, but I've got a separate video on my second channel I've made that shows you how you can turn a simple, flawed toggle clamp into an excellent hold-down using only a hacksaw, a screwdriver, drill, and a hammer. That link will be in the description and at the end of this video. There's an overhang from the jig that hangs over the blade, which is by design. Before we set it up to use, we'll cut it off so that we can set up our angles. To make a 4-sided box, we'll take our miter gauge and set it to 45 degrees. We'll cut the angle onto a scrap piece of wood and transfer that angle to the jig. We'll lock the block down at the angle and draw a line on the back of the sled where the angle lies. Of course, you can buy one of these guys and set the angle each time that way. When it's time to cut, we'll set the edge of our blade on the outer corner of the saw teeth. Lock the wood down and safely run it through the blade. As a bonus, it's really simple to add inline splines. In this example, I lined my wood up with the blade to make 45-degree cuts. I butted a scrap piece of wood up to my example piece, made my cut, and flipped it over. After lowering the blade, I ran it through again. If I were making a box, this would give me a great glue spline. If you'd like to see a little more on this, you can check out my advanced sled I originally made that will give you more information on these types of cuts, as well as the box joint jig that I also built with the sled. I personally want to thank my friend Sebastian for challenging me to make this. If you have a challenge for me, please leave a comment down below. I really enjoy problem solving. Hit the thumbs up, subscribe, ring the bell, and I thank you so much for being a part of my shop. Please leave a comment below, come find me on Instagram at MakeThingsWithRob, and remember to keep making things.